Live.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back. Our last live presentation of the afternoon comes from an old friend of the autumn school, Dr. Jim McAdam. Jim, like many people, found himself on the wrong side of the world when this pandemic first hit. And he's going to give us an interesting tale of himself and his experience, himself and his wife Geraldine, and our friend and colleague Joe Farrell, when they found themselves in the Patagonia when the pandemic hit last February and March. So back to yourself now, Jim. Afternoon, Jim.
Afternoon, Seamus. Thanks very much for having me along, and thanks for putting all this together. As you said, myself, Geraldine and Joe were just part of the furniture at Athy, and it's a great privilege to be able to talk this afternoon about our adventures and to introduce our friend Enrique Frears, who's actually listening in from Rio Grande in Terra del Fuego, probably one of our furthest away listeners today. So welcome, Enrique. What I really want to talk about is the Great Escape, and that was from our great southern journey we had long planned for earlier this year. And it was really a chance of a lifetime to escape, if you like, down to the southern ocean to visit the Falklands and southern Terra del Fuego on what was a journey of a lifetime. Our plans were to arrive in the Falklands on the 5th of February. And we flew the new route via Brazil. That was the second weekly flight that was open to the Falklands. Normally they only get a flight on a Saturdays, but through negotiation last year, they had arranged a new midweek flight, and we took that. It went well. Our plan was then to spend 5 weeks in the Falklands, and then on the 7th of March, fly to Punta Arenas in southern Chile, spend 2 weeks in southern Patagonia, mainly on Terra del Fuego, and come home the 22nd of March. Now, this all was about 8 months in the planning. We had a busy itinerary, and we were really wanting to see some memorable places some of us had never seen to before. And we used a lot of local contacts and friends in the region to put our trip together, particularly Enrique for some of the more difficult bits. So our overall objectives were, first of all, in the Falklands, to visit Keppel Island, which was a historic site associated with the mission to the Patagonian Indians. And quite a lot of this talk will be interweaving the whole interest of Fitzroy, Darwin, the Patagonian Indians, and how the Falklands was built into that. I won't go into the history of any of that anymore because it's a story that's worth telling in another longer talk. Then our second objective was, of course, to spend time in the museum in Stanley, to give some lectures, do some volunteering work there, and to build the Shackleton link between the museum and with Athy. And I'll come to the other objectives when we get later on in the talk. So in the Falklands, we had a house in Discovery Close, just off Shackleton Drive and Ross Road. What a polar link to set us up with. I had about 3 weeks to work to do, mapping some of the peatlands of the Falklands. Well, somebody has to do it. And I fitted that in with our travels. We went out to sit to West Falkland, to several of the lovely offshore islands. And to do that in the Falklands, you have to get the small government air service, Britain Norman Islander plane, which landed on grass airstrips and so on. And there's a picture of Joe just in the plane as we headed off. Our first objective was Keppel Island, an now uninhabited island on the northwest of West Falkland. A challenge to get there because islands that are uninhabited, planes can't land on them. So we had to go to the nearby, to the west, Saunders Island, spend a few days there to allow for weather. So we got our magical visit to Keppel. Saunders, as I said, is the gateway to Keppel. It was one of the first islands to be inhabited by the British in the 1760s, and the remains down there in the bottom left of the old Port Egmont settlement. We hired the little stone cottage on Saunders for a few days, and we had a great time. Saunders is also famous for its wildlife, and it has this unique sort of geological formation called the Neck, which is just teeming with wildlife. And we were there able to get up close with some of the penguins, albatrosses, cormorants, and even the tussock grass, and enjoy some wildlife. Then David was able to take us on his rib over to Saunders Island. One day was clear, and we got over there. As I said, or to Keppel Island, sorry. As I said, Keppel has the remains of the links with the early missionaries who set up a base there to try and the Victorian missionaries who tried they took Indians from Terra del Fuego and took them to Keppel. And there are the remains of that important part of the history of the islands. Just for example, the top right picture is the remains of a house which Jemmy Button stayed in. Now, those of you who are familiar with the whole Fitzroy and Darwin story will know the name Jemmy Button. He was the Yagan Indian he took to Britain in the 1830s. But I said that's for a deeper story. What our ambition was just to get there and see the remains of the settlement on that island, which we did. The rest of our time in Stanley, apart from my work, we saw and did an awful lot. Top left there is Joe looking at Shackleton Garter banner hanging in the cathedral in Stanley. The same symbols on it as was on the flag shown earlier in Bob Burton's picture. And we visited war cemeteries commemorating the dead from both sides in the 1982 campaign. We met in the bottom right there a crew of an ocean-going yacht who came from County Kerry and who we were linked up with. Lovely time. There in the middle, Joe's greeting Clara Mackay, who's the oldest resident in the Falkland Islands. And you get these competitions sometime where the question is, what is she saying to Joe in that picture? And in O'Brien's afterwards, let's have a quote, some examples of a quote there. We had some great fun, and there's the incident of the flying pumpkin, which Joe had to give up the best seat in the plane for. Talked to him in O'Brien's afterwards about that for a great story. There are, of course, very close Irish polar links with the Falklands. Crozier went there and as well commemorated, and of course Shackleton. And the whole Falklands history, and then also we have the famous visit of HMS Erebus and Terror in 1842, when James Clark Ross put a plaque there to measure the height of the exact height of the tide above sea level. And we got out to the remote settlement of Port Louis to see that. That's a very important measure because across the world it now gives a measure of sea level rise from positions like this, which have been determined so long ago. The Falklands' important history is brilliantly presented in the Historic Dockyard Museum, which anyone who visits the Falklands spend a day there, because it really just shows the whole island's history in terrific fashion. It's well presented. It involves so much of the local population, and it's really good. But of course, the museum also highlights the polar connection. The Falklands are the gateway to Antarctica, and here in their polar section, which is the bit that is interesting us today, we have, for example, a magnificent model of the Discovery, which is based there. And in the polar room itself, which highlights the gateway to the south, highlights the bonds between the Falklands. Of course, Shackleton is well commemorated. I'm not going to go into that because in the next clip you're going to see after my presentation, Andrea Barlow, who's the director of the museum, is going to take you on a virtual tour through that room in the museum in Stanley, and it will be really a revelation to you. It is terrific, because one of the really interesting things about the Stanley Museum is that the center of the room is a hut, a restored hut, which is the Reckless hut, which was built in the Falklands, taken down to the Antarctic, and housed such famous people as Wally Herbert, and is now rebuilt and being the center focus of that exhibition in the museum. What a link with the tie. While we were there, Joe gave 2 talks on Shackleton, full house for both, and those went down really well, and they really helped to cement just those links between Athy and the museum in Stanley, which we believe will be of great benefit to 2 small museums which are really going to punch well above their weight. But it was time to move on. We left the Falklands on the 7th of March, the second part of our trip. Although, because we were in such a remote part of the world, we did hear the news of what was going on in the rest of the world, but in some ways we were just isolated from it. The ideas of this pandemic that was spreading out into Europe and so on, it seemed so far away, it just wasn't relevant to us. But more about that later. On Patagonia and Terra del Fuego, as I say, we went across the 7th of March. We had plans to visit and stay in Punta Arenas to see the jetty where the Yell Show put in with the Endurance crew and Shackleton and other sites around Punta Arenas. We wanted to visit the grave of Pringle Stokes, whose death really changed history, and that Captain Fitzroy then replaced him and, of course, brought Darwin along, and that changed the course of a certain part of the world. We wanted to visit Woollahia on Navarino Island, a site that was very linked with Keppel Island in the Falklands through the massacre of some of the missionaries who came from there, and linked with Fitzroy and Darwin, and then visit two of the first British farms established on Terra del Fuego, because they were part of the descendants of the mission who were brought up on Keppel Island. Terra del Fuego in southern Patagonia is really just a large island. It's bigger than the British Isles, but yet it's a population of much, a few 100,000 people. It really is a barren, remote part of the earth. It's separated by the Straits of Magellan from the mainland of South America, and there are two crossing points, a short crossing at the north and a larger, much less used, more remote crossing from further south. We flew into Punta Arenas in southern Chile, where there's a good link with the Falklands. We stayed there a couple of nights with an old student friend of mine, Sergio Radic, who works in the university there, looked after us well. We hired a car, all arranged previously, and set off to travel around Terra del Fuego to see these sites that were our targets. So our first task was to get across the Straits of Magellan on the Patagonia there, and to visit Estancia Viamonte, one of the very early farms which belonged to the missionaries who settled there to colonize and evangelize the Indians there. There we met up with our good friend Enrique Freres. Enrique and I had been working together on planting tussock grass on peat for many years, and it was great that he could come along with us, help us out, and he had been very much involved in planning some of the more difficult and complicated parts of our journey. Terra del Fuego, as I said, is a huge expanse of land with very few people in it. The northern part of the island is very flat. They sort of plains which are just sparsely grazed with gravel roads and very few cars on them. Then you get down to the southern part of the island, which is where the southern Andes sweep right down to the tip of South America. And there you have magnificent snow-clad mountains, forests, and a completely inaccessible area with beautiful lakes and tremendous scenery. Our first stop, as I said, after Viamonte was to go to Estancia Harberton. There we met up with Tommy Goodall down on the bottom right there, the man in the beard. And he is a direct descendant, a great-great-grandson of Thomas Bridges, who had been brought up and trained on Keppel Island as a missionary and had gone across to establish the farm at Harberton in South America. An interesting little local collection, of course, Harry Ferguson, a great tractor designer from County Down. There's about probably the most southerly Ferguson tractor in that farm on Harberton. We called in at the museum in the capital of Ushuaia, which has an interesting polar exhibition in it. And if any of you are through on cruise ships, take a look at it. It is somewhat comic almost. It's based on life-size waxworks, but it's got all our heroes in there: Tom Crean, Shackleton, Worsley, as you can see, in life-size and in wax. And they're good, if somewhat stylized. But then we were now heading south to our ultimate destination. That was to get to Woollahia Cove on Navarino Island. To do that, we had to cross the Beagle Canal, or the Beagle Channel. And that is an international boundary between Argentina and Chile, which brings complications with it to get onto Navarino Island and visit and get to Port Williams, where we could then get a boat round to Woollahia. We crossed the Beagle Channel on that small rib-type ferry boat, and it's here we really had an unexpected novelty then. The crew told us to put on masks, and this was our first encounter with masks, and perhaps our first hint of the reality of the world that was to follow us when we got back. That was our first real version there. We got over to Puerto Navarino, which is just a tiny place with a few houses, and into Puerto Williams, not unlike Stanley. It's interesting historically. Up the top left there, you can see a replica of the bow of the Yelsho, which is the tug which had rescued Shackleton's compatriots from Elephant Island. And also you have a distinct, different, a long Irish connection, the Bernardo O'Higgins Plagan, the Plaza. Many places in Chile are named after O'Higgins with his Irish descent, because he was one of the leaders and founders of the Chilean nation. The small museum in Puerto Williams links really many of our interests together. It linked the mission in Keppel, where there was a stand to it, and the massacre in Woollaya. Missionaries in 1857 had gone, in 1859, had gone across from Keppel to Woollaya, but because of various events, they ended up being massacred at Woollaya Cove, and that set in pace a whole train of history, which we'll go into another day. So it's a difficult place to get to, but it's so steeped in history and well worth the effort to get there. Just over the back of those hills, there's Cape Horn, one of the wettest, windiest, wildest places on earth. And look at how lucky we are. On the day that we went, on the Friday, the 13th of March this year, it was absolutely flat, calm, and a sunny day. We were so fortunate just to get there, to be able to climb up the mountain and look down on Woollaya Cove itself. A couple of interesting shots. At the top left is Conrad Martin's famous painting of the Beagle in Murray Narrows in 1833. And there we are coming through the same spot very early morning in the ethereal mist of March this year. And then Parker Snow's painting of Button Sound in 1855. And there we're going back through there later that day, absolutely glassy, calm. We were so fortunate in the weather. And as we left there, we looked back in quiet reflection, but we were turning our gaze northwards and home. And the next day, we headed back on the ferry across the Beagle Canal to Ushuaia. But borders were starting to close around us. The journey back from Puerto Williams was much more difficult. We had to wait several hours to get into Argentina as we crossed the Beagle Canal, because they were quarantining anyone who had left Europe less than 2 weeks previously. And the border checks were manned by military and police personnel, and they were very rigorous in passport searching and so on. So we got into Ushuaia, collected our car, just stayed just one night. We'd planned to stay more, and we decided to head back north to Rio Grande. Luckily, Enrique was able to stay on with us, because there was a lot of translation of very rapid Spanish was needed along the way. We planned to cross the border on the remote border crossing in the middle of Terra del Fuego at San Sebastian. It was on the 15th. As I said, we were planning to stay in Rio Grande. News bulletins said that there would be a government announcement at 8 p.m. that evening about lockdowns, with Enrique translating for us. We left him home at his home at 7:30 that evening in Rio Grande, and decided to head for the border 150 kilometers north to get into Chile. With Enrique texting us along the way of news bulletins, at 8 o'clock, Argentina announced its borders would close to foreigners at midnight. We got through the frontier at 9:30, and I'm telling you, we had a relieved welcome bite in an austere little cafe just across the border, La Osteria Frontera, a memorable meal in that spot. So, but it was now 10 o'clock, it was dark at night. We still had 160 kilometers to do on a gravel road with only a couple of farms on the way, because this is a very remote part of the world. There's no accommodation. We had booked a hostel in Porvenir. On that journey, we only met two vehicles. One of them was in trouble at the side of the road. A couple of lads flagged us down. I must confess, Joe and I were probably slightly nervous about stopping in the dark on that barren road. But Geraldine, with the heart of gold, persuaded us to stop. And we're lucky we did, because the lads had a flat tire and they had the wrong wheel brace for the wheel nuts. We took our baggage out on the middle of the road, got our wheel brace, which luckily got their wheel off, and all was happy. And they gave us a huge hug at the side of the road, and we charged on and made it to Porvenir just in time. We like Porvenir. I hadn't been there much before. It was a small, like a frontier town almost, but it was like Stanley in the Falklands in many ways. We stayed a couple of days there and got the ferry back across to Punta Arenas to leave our car back and so on. Our last few days, we took a chance to visit some of the Shackleton sites in Punta Arenas. For example, the jetty at Rio Seco. This is where the Yell show, when she was coming back from Elephant Island, put in there to telegraph forward to Punta Arenas a few miles up down the coast that they were coming, so the civic reception and the bands and all could be brought out to welcome Shackleton and his colleagues back. The jetty is a national monument, but sadly it's in a poor state of repair. On the top left there, we went to see the house, Charlie Millward's house, where Shackleton, Crean and Worsley had stayed in Punta Arenas. We looked at St. James's Anglican Church and the British School, where Shackleton gave a couple of famous lectures, and he's in the visitors book in that church. The Reverend Cater organised those, and where he was able to drum up support to get him and his colleagues rescued from Elephant Island. There were a few other sites to see around Punta Arenas before we left. We travelled south to find the grave of Pringle Stokes on a barren, lonely spot beside the road. And as I said, he died. He committed suicide actually in 1828, and his death led to the appointment of Fitzroy as captain of the Beagle. And of course, before we left, a final visit to the Shackleton Bar in that famous hotel in Punta Arenas, and to see the photograph of the boss on the wall, signed by his granddaughter, Alexandra Shackleton. By now it was the 17th of March. Messages from home were getting increasingly worrying. So we rescheduled to leave on Thursday, the 19th of March. We were so fortunate that we had booked through a travel agent in the Falklands, someone I had used many times, and she was able to just find us flights home by changing our route, and we had really no worries on that score. Indeed, we had actually contemplated staying on Terra del Fuego or Punta Arenas for several months, 2 or 3 months. We thought that might be far safer than going home, the stories we're getting. But only yesterday, I got a message from Enrique saying, "Jim, you remember you thought of staying here in March? Well, the local news today is that the hospital and private health system in Terra del Fuego has completely collapsed." Such were the COVID cases in. So finally, we left from Punta Arenas at 4 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, flew north to Santiago, to Chile, then on to Sao Paulo and on to London. We arrived in a deserted Heathrow and to an Ireland we could not have conceived of. Our great southern journey ended in the strangest of circumstances. We had just got home by the skin of our teeth. Thank you to everyone in Athy, to the whole team for putting this day on. It's been a real privilege to participate in it. All the best to everyone and keep safe.
Jim, thanks. That was an extraordinary story, particularly the last few minutes of it there as well. Now, there's a question here that came in over Facebook. You had touched upon it there at the very end about the effects of the pandemic in Patagonia. But how is the pandemic affecting the Falklands at the present time, both socially and economically?
Well, the Falklands has an advantage in that it's an island which is with only 2 routes to get into it, and quite quickly the links with South America were cut off. So there's really only depending on one link, which is the military, the RAF link to the islands, and that's under control. There have been no cases of COVID in the Falklands at all since the start. They've managed to keep the civilian population completely clear. So that's a good thing, and life is going on as normal on the islands. But economically, of course, it's posing huge challenges, because the Falklands tourism industry depends very much on cruise ship tourism, and cruise ships are a huge risk to bringing the pandemic, and the whole cruise industry is really going to collapse this year. So there's really going to be virtually no cruise ship industry. Also, their wool clip this year, they're unable to export that because it depended on going to China. There's no Chinese won't take anything from outside, from South America or anywhere. So the local government has bought up the entire wool clip from the islands and is storing that. So they will get through, I think. I mean, the country is well managed and run, and but the pandemic is going to affect them very much, particularly through the tourism sector.
That's great, Jim. Thank you. That comes to the end of our session. Thanks very much for that. We'll be back in about 10 minutes with our final session of the afternoon, presented by Kevin. And actually, that relates to the Falklands Island Museum. We'll see you later.
Greetings from Helen and Damien McCarthy here in Dublin. We've been smitten by the Shackleton bug since we first visited the Antarctic more than 10 years ago.
We've never missed a trip to the autumn school since then, and we've no intention of doing so this year.
So congratulations and thank you to the committee for organising this 2020 virtual session. And we've no doubt but that the lectures will be as interesting, enlightening and wonderful as over all the other years. So cheers.